Ani Bojo, Jamanang Nodin Queen Dishnakas, Satellite Dojiva, Mayan Dodo. Hi, my name is Colleen Cardinal. I'm co-organizer and family member of Families of Sisters in Spirit based in Ottawa, otherwise known as Algonquin Unceded Territory. We were asked to submit a video statement to support Stop the Arrests, Sex in the City International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers.
Hi. Okay, thanks, Colleen. I also wanted to, before I get started, thank Arlene and the organizers and Amy for being there, and also I'm really excited that you're watching Monica's film.
Yay!
Remember the Living, because it's really excellent. So we're happy that you've included us in your space from a distance. So we appreciate that. So I'll introduce myself, Kristen Gilchrist. So what Families of Sisters in Spirit has going for our December 17th, we have organized, Families of Sisters in Spirit has organized with Power, which is the Prostitutes of Ottawa Gatineau Work, Educate, Resist for the past 3 years. For December 17th, and this year it's our first year inside. Good idea. And we've decided to make the space entirely emphasizing the lived experiences of Indigenous sex working women, Two-Spirit people, which I think is really important and doesn't really happen enough. I think a lot of the sex workers' rights stuff, it tends to be focused on issues that specifically white sex workers or sex trading folks experience. So I think it's really important in our context in Ottawa, and I'm sure in your context in Sault Ste. Marie, to make sure that there are spaces for Indigenous people to speak about their own experiences, and yeah, in creating a space that's dismantles the savior industrial complex and all of those problems. So we'll have this screening with Monica's film as well. We'll have the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, who is also organizing with us and who've been almost like mentors for us for a number of years in understanding the relationships between sex work, sex trade, and colonization, and also Indigenous women's self-determination. And so we'll be having them as well, and we'll be having a community member with personal or lived experiences in the sex trade, including in Vancouver's downtown east side. So instead of what we've done in the past, which has been like a visual type of event, this year we decided to bring it sort of indoors and make it more about community learning. And some of what Families of Sisters in Spirit has been able to do is ally up with other organizations in Canada, in Ottawa, that are starting to look at sex workers' rights from a decolonizing perspective. So the idea that we cannot have a discussion about sex work or trafficking for that matter without understanding the history and the roots of violence in Canada and against Indigenous peoples and nations, and specifically Indigenous women, and the ways that colonialism has laid the groundwork for lots of gendered forms of violence, and including violence against sex workers and incarcerated women and other folks who've been systematically pushed to the margins. So around decolonizing sex work, which is a theme of our December 17th event, is the idea that Indigenous folks in sex trade need to speak for themselves first and foremost, and that our job as allies, settler allies, and as Indigenous allies as well, I guess, would be to take lead from those who are mostly affected. So it's not about us knowing what's best for those who are working or trading. It's obviously about them speaking from their own experiences. They know what's best. And part of meeting folks where they're at is, and I mean, especially in the work we do, is making sure that we're supporting folks before they're missing and murdered. So not only do we support, loved ones and those who are affected, but we're like actively working to ensure that the conditions do not continue to perpetuate the violence. Whether it's interpersonal violence, violence that we might see, typically, that the media focuses on, like client-based violence, but also state violence and violence that happens because of the police, violence that police and courts and correctional officers and parole systems and child welfare systems, and supporting one another through these really destructive systems. So to make sure that harm reduction is part of the work that we're doing, and really in just our everyday relationships with one another. And in a way that just affirms one another's dignity and self-determination, and I think for a lot of white folks in the sex workers' rights movement or in some other left-wing movements still don't see Aboriginal women, Indigenous women, as needing to be at the center. There's this idea that we really can't imagine our movements as anything but led by white folks, which was recently pointed out by Andrea Smith. I think some of the work that Families of Sisters in Spirit needs to be doing or should be emphasizing in our future is looking at youth, because the statistics say that those women who are younger, Two-Spirit people who are younger, like in their late teens and early 20s, are at the highest risks of being killed or disappeared or otherwise assaulted. So we think it's important to include the voices of the youth, right? The people who are labeled at risk. I think, although I'm not Indigenous, when I was a teenager, I would have got that same label. And I think that's probably true of a lot of us, right? So that if something had happened to us, or these things did happen to us, it's because we were high risk. And I think even though Families of Sisters in Spirit we're really well intentioned, I think because we don't have a lot of young people in our core organizing, then sometimes the language can be a little bit like paternalistic. And so I think putting the young people who are most at risk of being disappeared and murdered, and allowing them to direct the process. So I think that's something that we're going to be aiming to do. Yeah, because we don't want to be replicating the same. I was going to swear there. We don't want to replicate the same systems, the same paternalistic colonial systems that try to save people from themselves and rob people of their agency and their dignity. And so I think part of our work too is making sure that we're supporting young people in the sex trade who I think are often pushed out of the discussion because there's an idea that we can stand up for sex work as something consensual and happens among adults, but so when it's young people who are trading, they we don't talk about them, or they ended up getting pushed out of the conversation, and I think that's really dangerous. And I think it's our responsibility as allies and as sex workers and friends and family of sex workers to make sure that we're doing that. And although our experiences are important, we need to be centering Two-Spirit, Indigenous people, young people, trans, because we know that they bear the brunt of the violence on an everyday basis. The state violence is more likely to fall onto them. The systems that they get locked into, are really pervasive and strong. So I think it's our responsibility to make sure that, we're listening to young people and not telling people that they need to go home, or that shaming people who disappear, go missing. Understanding that there are legitimate reasons why people are having to flee their environments, and why group homes and foster homes and child welfare systems are things that are violent, and young people need to run away from them. So we have to be there to support them without judgment and without saying that we know what's best. And I think we can apply that in general in the movement, right? So it's not about, we know what's best for ourselves, but we need to respect other people's dignity and self-determination for themselves. And that's not conflating sex work with trafficking. That's not, and it's not about just focusing on sex work. It's about focusing on these broader structures of violence, because I don't believe that sex work is inherently violent. I don't think that there's anything abusive about exchanging, material, sex for material or anything like that. I don't think there's inherent violence there, but I think it's these other systems, that put people at risk and push them to the margins and then reinforce their victimization. And so, that's, I think, important work that we do, especially in building relationships on the ground. Families of Sisters in Spirit has engaged at all levels at this point. So we've been to the UN twice. We've participated in Senate committees and special committees at the federal level. had sit-down meetings with MPs. We've met with national Aboriginal organizations, Amnesty International, NGOs. And after all of that, I think our work just still comes back to building relationships in our own communities. Like the grassroots work for us is where our heart is. And I mean, it's because where we live, it's where we live too. It's what we're also living. But so that's where our focus is, and that's, and so far it's been pretty effective. And we're happy to be included in other spaces and really just to be able to see what y'all are doing over there and, building bridges. Yeah.
I'll talk a little bit, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
about me. So I'll speak a little bit about my involvement in Family Sisters in Spirit and my role and how I came to be involved in Family Sisters in Spirit. I fled. I actually grew up in Sault Ste. Marie. Holla! I moved away from there in 2011. Actually, I left that community in 1989. I fled my home. My sisters and I were adopted from Alberta and raised in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, in a non-Indigenous home out in Hayden. And that household was tremendously violent. We experienced a lot of racism as children, and my sisters and I all ended up fleeing home by the time we were 15 years old. We found our way back to Edmonton and found our parents and our family. And at that time, I had no insight into what had happened to my family. Nobody told me. Nobody would share with me any stories of why we were given up for adoption or what had happened to my mom or my dad. Nobody had any insight. Everybody was, just really involved in drinking and lots of violence and drug use. And so for the next 10 to 12 years, I experienced a lot of violence out in Edmonton. I seen a lot of violence. I experienced a lot of violence, and violence was a way of life for me. I didn't know any other way. But I also had no insight. Nobody was there to teach me any different, or talk about like Canada's colonial history. So I ended up fleeing an abusive marriage and moved back to Sault Ste. Marie in 1998. It was the only place that I knew to go. I had nowhere else to go. And I tried to salvage a relationship with my adoptive family, which was really hard. I ended up raising my children on my own. I have 4 children who are now adults. And during my time in Edmonton, my eldest sister was murdered. She was murdered in 1990. She was 20 years old. She left behind 2 children. And my husband's sister, my sister-in-law, Lynn Jackson, was also murdered out in Edmonton, just outside of Edmonton in a town called Wetaskiwin. Her case is still unsolved. During my healing, after I moved back to Sault Ste. Marie and I started healing and learning about what happened to my family, I realized that, part of the problem was how the government's colonial policies impacted my family through residential school, through the 60 scoop and the taking of my sisters and I, but also in how the media perpetuates racism and hatred against Indigenous women, Two-Spirit people in Canada. And I seen it reflected in when my sister was murdered and how they portrayed her in the newspaper as being like a person with dark skin found in a park that was frequented by prostitutes and drug dealers, and basically making it look like it was her own fault that she was killed. I was 16 years old when that happened. I had no idea about how to confront media. I just knew that what they were doing was intrusive. And then I look at how the media reported on Lynn's murder, and there's very, very little coverage. Very, very little coverage. I think maybe the article for hers was maybe 3 sentences long, if that. And there's been no follow-up. And she's one of up to 40 women that's been found killed and murdered around Edmonton, and really there's nothing been done about it. And we see it every day. Every day now in the media we're seeing, Indigenous women go missing or being murdered, and nothing's being done. So my involvement in FSIS is about talking about why nothing's being done, and talking about how colonial history and colonial historical violence through residential school and child welfare policy, how that's impacted Indigenous people, and how it's still impacting Indigenous people, and how it's impacting our children, how we're seeing it reflected in society. All right, so part of my role as an organizer with FSIS is to, I speak from lived experience, so I share my experience of how my sisters and I were impacted, and try to relate it with other survivors or other family members, and also like helping to educate non-Indigenous settlers, even like newcomer settlers to Canada, and helping them understand how colonization has impacted Indigenous people, but also making sure that we create safe spaces for all people where they're at, not just like not just families of missing and murdered Indigenous women, but also like sex trading, sex working women, Two-Spirit, and trans people, because we want to make sure we include everybody and that they're all valued.
So I'll give a brief background to Families of Sisters in Spirit. We started 3 years ago. It'll be 3 years in January. We're a grassroots, all volunteer, nonprofit, bare bones, completely unfunded group located in Ottawa that is led by families of missing and murdered Indigenous women with allies and friends like me. And so we started in response to cuts the government had made to an existing program called Sisters in Spirit. It's pretty well known when you hear of the 600 missing and murdered women statistic that comes from that work. But that project was defunded. Bridget Tolley and myself, sort of on a whim, had said, hey, let's see if we can start something and keep it going. It was just like completely unacceptable that, something emphasizing the experiences of Indigenous women around violence and also resistance was going to be cut. So we just decided, keep it going. And we ended up allying up with POWER, which is the Ottawa-based sex workers' rights organization, and then also Native Youth Sexual Health Network. One of our strategies is to operate outside of the state itself. So we're not like a registered anything on purpose, because we don't want to have our status or our legitimacy determined by a state, and we don't want the surveillance and all of that. So we believe in again working at the community level and with one another and supporting each other on a day-to-day basis, not just like a couple of events every year or when a Supreme Court decision is coming down, but really on an ongoing everyday basis. Mm-hmm. Because it's ongoing. The work is ongoing, right? So we could be like we're constantly organizing. I know that, and I think we're up somewhere. Sometimes it's like one event a week. Sometimes it's 3 events a week, and really it's just a lot of like talking and listening and public ed and supporting other grassroots organizations and strategizing together and how we can build sustainable movements and support each other while we do the work, because the work is hard.